That's how the game goes. Pretty good.
I think they won a mic for the
Not a bad person.
Hello, everyone. We do have a couple seats up here in the front if you are looking for a seat. This is Left Bank Books presents TV editor for the Los Angeles Review of Books and a lecturer at Washington University in St. Louis, Phillip Maciak, who will discuss his funny, insightful work of cultural criticism and history, Avidly Reads Screen Time. I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This is a beautiful crowd. Thank you. And if you, I am Shane Mullen. I'm the event coordinator for Left Bank Books. With your help, I am able to produce over 200 author events per year. It is a lot. And because you come out, support the events, that is how we are able to continue bringing in such incredible authors and focusing on really incredible local authors like Phillip and Martin. Not only when you purchase a book does it help us continue to present this event series, it also keeps your streets paved, your libraries funded, your parks free. All of that is because of your tax dollars when you spend locally instead of buying from that other place that is really, really terrible. So thank you all so much for being here and for supporting Left Bank Books. Let me get into, I'm going to let you discuss kind of the bulk of the book. So I'm going to introduce our fantastic authors. Martin Riker is the co-founder and publisher of the feminist press Dorothy, a publishing project with someone else who was in the room, and the author of Samuel Johnson's Eternal Return. He teaches in the English department at Washington University in St. Louis, and his criticism has appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, among other publications. We do have Martin's books available for sale at the desk. Phillip Maciak is the TV editor for the Los Angeles Review of Books and a lecturer in English and American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author of The Disappearing Christ, Secularism in the Silent Era, and his writing has appeared in Slate, The New Republic, and The Week, among other places. Without further ado, would you all please help me in warmly welcoming our fantastic guests.
You go press the button.
You can press the hold it down.
I think you press the button.
Hello. It doesn't sound any different to me.
No.
But you can hear through it.
I can hear you.
It's taking it away because I'm doing it wrong.
There you go. Try to play with that. It sounded like you co-founded the feminist press with Danielle and Samuel Johnson.
Yeah, it's a three thing. Just an update to Phil's bio, which is that Phil has recently been named the TV critic for the New Republic. And, there I am. And I'm excited to talk to him about that at some point. So I'm Marty, and I'm really, really happy to be here to talk about Phil's amazing book, and which I've now read 3 times, and which keeps yielding more riches every time I open it. We're going to talk for a little bit. Well, he's going to talk. I'm just going to ask some questions. And then at some point we'll open it up, and hopefully lots of people have questions. I think we talked ahead of time, and what we're mostly going to do is sort of map out what the book's doing, with the assumption that most people in the room haven't had a chance to read it yet, so that then you can have questions based on all that stuff. So the book's called Screen Time, and Phil, I thought you could start by just talking to us about this term, Screen Time, which is so central to the book, and all the different ways that term means.
Thanks, Marty. And thanks, Left Bank, for having us, and all my friends and family who are here. So Screen Time, I think the easiest way to talk about it is that screen time for me in the book is a sort of phenomenon, right, and a thing that we keep track of, right? How much time do you spend looking at screens? How much time do your kids spend looking at screens? How much time do the people you know spend looking screens, but it's also a phenomenon with a history, and it's a history that is that dates back to a particular moment in time. The book traces it back to an editor of Mother Jones magazine in 1991 by a critic named Tom Engelhardt, who I talk about a lot in this book, and who is alive and who I have not contacted, and I'm worried every day. Sneak out from behind something and be like, "You missed my left critique." But so it comes the rebranding of that idea of screen time, which used to be a sort of a metric for telling how much time an actor spent on the screen, right? So if you got cast in a sitcom or Law and Order or something, you had 5 minutes of screen time. Tom Engelhardt kind of rewrote it in 1991 and said screen time is now a metric for you at home and for your kids specifically. And so screen time in the book is both this sort of catalog of what you're watching, what screens you're watching it on, but it's also a narrative that I sort of unfold historically, right? That it's this idea of what that screen time means, and how that has sort of changed, how it has become part of a sort of everyday life that we have with our devices, but also the way that it's become part of a moral panic and part of the anxiety that we all just sort of sit with all the time. So that's what I mean by screen time, I guess. I'm going to pass the mic back to you.
I'm going to go off script already.
Sure.
So you're talking about the history of the term screen time, which I think is an accurate description of what you're doing. But you also in the book talk a lot about the sort of the history of the types of screens that we watch.
Right.
So it kind of starts with television and kind of moves through to the contemporary. Can you talk a little bit about that transition, maybe even just in terms of how you're using the term?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, movies have a long history of anxiety that is specific to movies, that's specific to movie theaters and their relationship. And if you want to read a much less bouncy version of that argument, you can read my other book that I wrote about Jesus and movies. You can. It's on. It's not a lot of people have chosen to do it. I'm one of the people who does. But the story that I'm telling here is really a story that's a TV story, and part of it is. So screen time is about how much time you spend looking at screens, but in that it's about the personal relationship that you have with them. And TVs have always been personal. They live in our living rooms. There's a part in the book where I talk about this great historian of televisions, not TV, but televisions, who talks about how the second version of the sort of farmhouse in Levittown, New Jersey, had an admiral television set built into the walls of the home as part of the original plan. And so the sort of anxiety about and also closeness that we feel toward screens is a television history. And so when we talk about the other screens that pop up in this book, pads and tablets and phones and things like that, I think in a lot of ways we're sort of playing variations on this original feeling and relationship that we have with television, and televisions specifically, and the way that they enter into and become a part of our domestic lives, and the comfort that we get from that. Maybe like there's a hearth, that's where they're supposed to be in the living room. That's certainly where they were in Levittown. But they're also, surveillance, and they're also advertisers, and they're also these sort of creeping devils that come into our homes.
I actually think one of the things I'm thinking about while you're talking is something I thought was really interesting, because of course it is mostly about television, and does a lot of close readings of television for over a few decades. But one of the things that happens is as you moved into the more contemporary period, you go into different kinds of screens. And then something that I noticed that was kind of interesting was there's a distinction between those kinds of screens. But then as it goes on, this distinction kind of goes away. Like actually it becomes all screen, sort of in a way that I thought was really interesting. Though it's a work of criticism, as we've sort of already started to talk about, you also draw a lot on your personal experience in this book. At times the book becomes almost a memoir of your own life and your experiences with screens. And I was hoping you could read an excerpt that's sort of illustrated, because it's really what makes this book stylistically, sort of its own thing.
Yeah, thank you. So I picked out a little spot. I'm not going to read for that long because this is, we're having a conversation, but this is a tight 5, as I said before. I will say, because my parents are here, And my daughter Maeve is here, who provided illustrations that you'll see in the book. And also, this Scratch and Sniff Blueberry Muffin bookmark that I'm using, which I got from the library. So I'm going to read a section that involves them. So this is from the second chapter in the book, called The Screen Time Era. When I was little, I learned to tell time through television. Whenever I needed to count things down, getting ready to withstand a long trip, or frenziedly waiting for a friend to arrive for a play date, my parents would give me an estimate based on the unit of time that I knew more intimately than any other, the length of a single episode of DuckTales. I would watch DuckTales, Disney's 1987 cartoon series, in our basement on a large wood-paneled RCA color track TV set that could swivel. I loved DuckTales, and like anything you love, I developed a sense of what to expect from it, what I wanted, what gave me pleasure. I can still remember the satisfying liquid crunch of Scrooge McDuck nosediving into his vault filled with gold coins. I can still hear the theme song rattling around in my head. I know exactly, very instinctively now, how long an episode lasts. So when I wonder out loud how long something was going to take, my parents could tell me that it's another 2 DuckTales until we get there, or he'll be here in 4 DuckTales. Eventually I just asked, how many DuckTales is it? A DuckTale to me was a meaningful and deeply familiar duration. This bodily awareness of televisual time that we learn through television isn't unusual. Even cartoon dogs have it. There's an episode of Bluey, one of the shows that Maeve and her younger sister Phoebe will consent to watch together, where sisters Bluey and Bingo are waiting to pick up takeout at a Chinese restaurant with their dad, Bandit. Bandit tells them it'll be 5 minutes, and Bingo, squirming, asks her dad how long 5 minutes is. He thinks for a minute, and then he replies, it's 1 episode of Chutney Chip. Maeve and Phoebe, in turn, often tell time by way of Bluey. They know that there's a difference, for instance, between how much time they'll be cuddled up on the couch if we're watching an episode of Bluey, 7 minutes, versus an episode of Spirit, Riding Free, around 22 minutes. They budget their own time, budget what they're asking for based on those time scales. They'll ask for Bluey if they know that we're trying to squeeze in a quick episode after dinner or before we have to go somewhere. They'll ask for Spirit, which, unlike Bluey, is both longer and serialized across episodes, if there's a more open-ended, expansive time ahead. Before we could read a clock, before we could set a timer, before we could reliably sort out the difference between minutes and hours, TV provided a template in time slots. And then, DuckTale after DuckTale, Bluey after Bluey, we are learning what time is, what it's for, and how much a unit of it can matter. We've talked already, or I've talked already, in the book I've talked already. I've talked already, to you in the future I will have talked about what people are worried about when they worry about screen time. They're worried about control, about contamination, about kids growing up the wrong way, or just a different way than they did. They're worried about physical fitness and mental health, and eyesight, and violence, and sleep, and consumerism. These are all things that screens and screen media are imagined to degrade or damage or devilishly encourage if we spend too much time with them. But what about the screens themselves? How do screens spend their time? We try to protect our kids and ourselves from wasting too much time on screens, but it's also true that screens have irreparably altered the way that we understand what time even is. Screen time is a mode of organizing time. It's a way of policing it, a way of assigning value to it. And as a valuable possession, it's a currency, and it's a currency that can be misspent, taxed, squandered, invested smartly or foolishly. It is a life measured out in DuckTales, and it is naturally or unnaturally fast at its excessive boundaries. Too fast, but inasmuch as screen time is a kind of time, it's also a part of historical time. People have been worried about TV and about screens since these things have existed, but as I've said, the modern form of these debates we date to the 1990s. To lend a name to something is to lend it a coherence that it may have lacked before. And this anxiety, this possibility, this time was given a name in 1991, and it still answers to that name today, the screen time era. But as we know, screen time is not just a kind of time, it's also a feeling. The viewer of the screen time era is acutely and increasingly aware of how much they're watching, but they're also aware of how that quantity of screen time makes them feel. This is a viewer whose guilt, pleasurable or otherwise, about their own spectatorship is an active part of their own, of their point of view. And so this viewer increases their connoisseurship, their fastidious supervision about the kinds of programs in which they will invest their screen time. They're in control, or at least they value the feeling of control. But this is also a viewer who is potentially out of control, binging, scrolling, hate watching. The viewer of the screen time era, regardless, is incredibly self-conscious about their viewership, its investment of time in an anxious way. And the programs they watch have evolved to mirror that self-consciousness and that anxiety too. So how has the screen time era shaped not only the way people watch screens, but what people have put on screens for them to watch? What forms are unique to the screen time ecosystem? All your favorite hits from the 90s to today. Prestige TV serials, House Hunters, TiVo, Nintendo Wii, CGI preschool cartoons, The Real World, Microsoft Word, the Notes app, Vine, YouTube videos of UFOs, iMessage, Wikipedia, the Twitter scroll, Google Maps, Pokemon Go, Peloton, Twitch, Skyguide, and every other GPS app that tells you where you are in the world through the imagined animation of a screen. These are the forms of the screen time era. That's all.
I'm really glad you picked that part. It's maybe my favorite part of the book, and I think it's an exceptional example of what's so special about the project, which is demonstrated from the reading, and that your own experience is not just sort of there to dress up the arguments, but it seems like an essential part of the project. So I wanted to ask about why you thought drawing on your experience was important to what is ostensibly a critical work.
So I mean, I think that's a good question. I appreciate you saying that it doesn't feel like window dressing. In part because I think that, you know, one of the things that everybody watches different things, and everybody watches the things that they watch in different ways, and especially now in the sort of era that we would call peak TV, right? This era of just intense availability and sort of unwatchable masses of television and other media content. It's hard to make sort of sweeping arguments about what we're watching, right, at any given time. And those arguments are always inadvisable anyway, but they're like especially bad now because we're not watching anything in a sort of collective sense. And so what was really important to me about this book, and what I realized working with Sarah Medsley, my editor, and the editor of this series, who I think just deserves a lot of credit for the book that this is, sort of understood, or eventually understood about this book, was that it had to be about my screen time. It had to be about what I watch, and to some extent what Nate and Phoebe and what we as a family watch, and what I with my parents watch too, which is part of the book as well. And if you start writing about if I start writing about what I'm watching in a personal way, given the sort of basic thesis of this book that screen time is always personal, then it has to become about me, right? It has to be about the way that I watch those things and the universe in which I encounter them and the ways that I engage them, both in terms of my eye as a critic or a scholar, but also the room that I'm in, the people that I'm with, and things like that. So the sort of memoiristic aspects of it, I think are sort of crucial to anything that I have to say or any kind of authority that I have about this, because the only authority that I can bring to it is my own experience as a viewer, and giving the reader an understanding of what that is, right? What that looks like or what shape that is, was a big part of sort of framing this book.
Yeah. No, I think that's a critical insight. You and I have talked about. You're welcome. You and I have talked about how the history of media studies is largely written as a history of the industries. It's not really written as a history of the viewer experience. And I've since we had that conversation, I've kind of wondered if this is one of the reasons, because that experience is a subjective experience, and it's hard to sort of put that in a scholarly space. And so you've given yourself, you've identified that as a problem, and you've come up with a solution. Given that you embrace this sort of personal stuff, which I think works really awesome in the book, did it for you create any kinds of challenges from as a critical writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess that the first challenge was that there was originally going to be a lot more Mad Men in this book, and my editor said, "Not everybody is seeing Mad Men," and I said, "Oh, fine." And so that was part of it, right? Just like getting over my initial, either like the holes in my viewing or the parts that I've oversaturated with one particular text. And so I think it was important to the first chapter is sort of organized in a sort of structural gambit around a couple of scenes from Mad Men. So it's the most sustained work that I do on a particular show in the book, but I skip around a lot to a lot of different things in here. But I guess a part of the challenge was just learning how to write this way, like learning how to integrate that kind of the personal, like you said, to not have it just be window dressing, right? To not just have it be the first paragraph of the book that I then pivot away to something else. I've been writing television criticism for 11 years now, and the way that I started doing it, and I write about this in the book too, was with people. I had a group of other critics and writers who I met on the internet, which you may have heard of. And we started a blog together called Dear Television, and that blog eventually became a column at Los Angeles Review of Books and the New Republic and a couple of other places. And the way that we wrote was to each other. We would write letters. And so one person would write a letter about an episode, and then the next person would write back to them. And so they would say whatever they thought about the show or whatever they thought about the episode, but they would also have to be responding to this other person. And so we would do it in this kind of like, round robin format. So by the end of, this was the beginning of the blog, we were writing, 12,000 words of criticism about a particular episode that was just a conversation between us that was sort of, that was epistolary in that way. And I think a lot of the way that I see writing about television, writing about screens and things like that is through that sort of understanding of it as a social thing, right? That I'm writing criticism to somebody. Always, and so I think to some extent the problem of how to make this about me as much as it was about the TV shows and things like that was to sort of draw on that sort of foundational experience for me of understanding this to be social, understanding this to be something that I want to write so that people can see, the DuckTales thing. I read the DuckTales thing in part because a lot of people in sort of far-flung places who are friends or acquaintances who've read that section have said, oh, well, it wasn't DuckTales for me, it was this other show or something like that. And so to be able to write my own experience, but in such a way that could provide these little seats for other people to sit on and sort of see their experiences through was part of what I was trying to do.
Yeah. I'm going to skip ahead of my questions, and I'm going to limit myself to 2 more questions so that there's time for everybody else. Just coming off of what you're saying, your previous book was much more traditionally scholarly, and so you wrote this, what I guess would be called public-facing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts about the role of the public intellectual and why you went this direction yourself, what your hopes are for critical writing in general.
Yeah, so I think it's like I said, I've been doing this for 11 years, and for a lot of that time, I was working in academia primarily, and this was kind of like the thing I did on the side, or the thing I did after when I wasn't writing my dissertation or when I wasn't teaching and things like that. And I still teach, obviously, but in the position that I have now, I have a lot more ability to sort of dedicate my writing energy to public-facing stuff, to what I've been doing as an editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books, and then also this writing for the New Republic and other places. I think, so a lot of because for a lot of this past decade or so, I've been sort of balancing these two things. I think I've thought a lot about how you do it, right? Is this separate? I think to me, the separation was helpful because in my sort of, with my scholarly hat on, I was writing about much different material than I was writing about. I wasn't writing scholarship about, contemporary television shows. I was writing scholarship about early film and 19th century American literature and things like that. But, the style is different and the address is different. But the thing that I think I came to realize was that it's just about sort of translating a different type of address and understanding that there is a citational practice in public writing that is just rendered, integrated into the thing. It's not, footnotes. It's haptics and things like there's just a different attitude towards it, but it's no less citational than anything else. And that both of those things, whether it's scholarship or whether it's public writing, are again social things, right? A professor of mine when I first started graduate school like to say that a scholarly argument is about you going to a party and trying to join a conversation that has already been happening. And sort of proving that you can enter that conversation and then sort of introducing something new. And I think that I like that framing, and I think it applies to this too, right? Which is the thing you would get in trouble with, especially in the sort of headier blog days of 2012 when I was starting to do this stuff, was that if you made an argument that some other blogger had made, like people would really come after you for it. Like, did you not read this? They would just begin like spammed with all of these. So there was always this anxiety of like, well, I have to make sure that I'm in conversation with somebody here. And I think that's that anxiety. Well, this is a book about how anxiety become generative, and that's one that I think has been generative for me.
Yeah. Generative is a good word for it. I mean, even formally generative. Thinking about your background with critical stuff, with scholarly stuff, and how you sort of solve the problem of how you could write this book and bring the personal into it. I think it's really generative and really exciting. I am going to stop and see if anybody else has questions, and then I'll say I have one more question I want to ask. I'll save it so that I don't take all the time. So, other people with questions. I could carry the mic. It's helpful. Questions?
All right. Can you give me the question?
You can ask one of my questions.
Yeah. Marty wrote down my question. I actually emailed it to Marty. But now I think it might be a really stupid question because I just don't know anything about media studies. So you just referred to a television show as a text in passing, and that's sort of related to my question. So I'm realizing like this might just be me being dumb, but okay, I was just listening to an NPR segment on the television writers' strike. This was like last week when I emailed this question to Marty. And someone said, quote, TV and movies are the literature of today. It was a roundtable conversation, and no one followed up on that. But I was just sitting there cooking, and I was like, what? And it seemed like that was just accepted as true in the conversation, or at least it was an uncomplicated opinion to have.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know what you think of that, but maybe this is like a really basic question I'm asking in like Media Studies 101 or something. Okay.
No. So this is the part where I get polemical. Look at everybody. No, they're not the same thing. If I were on that panel, there would have been some distortion on the microphone when I was replying to the person who said that. The television is not the literature of today. Television is the television of today, and literature is the literature of today, and bicycles are the bicycles of today, and cats are the cats of today. I've written about this a good bit actually in both public and I was going to say private and academic context, functionally private context. Whispered to my reader. But there are a number of histories of this thing where I refer to it sometimes as media confusion, which is the idea that, and I'll talk about it in a specifically TV-based context. The Sopranos and Sex and the City came out in the late 90s, and everything changed in terms of the television landscape. I'm sorry. I would say that also House Hunters came out in the late 90s, the same year. That's a whole different argument, but it's an argument I really like talking about. But Sopranos and Sex and the City are the ones. And the what changed with HBO is that they wanted to promote their shows and their products as not just good, but like qualitatively better than other TV, right? This isn't network, this isn't broadcast, this is something else. And the route that, it's not just HBO, but the route that HBO, and I think a lot of critics too, chose to take in talking about and framing shows like that was not just that they were qualitatively better, but that the easiest way to frame that was to say that they were qualitatively different, right? So it's not TV, it's HBO was the tagline for HBO in the aughts. And along with that came this argument that TV is the new novel, or TV is replacing the novel, or the novel is dying and the person who is, choking it to death is TV. And I think that it's to some extent, it's almost like a marketing strategy that has somehow leached into critical life, right? So that people say things like, well, this show is so good, it's almost right? Or novelistic, the really good TV shows, good examples of this, are extremely televisual objects, right? The Sopranos is a soap opera and a gangster drama, and it's a piece of genre piece. And Sex and the City is a sitcom, and it's a melodrama, and it's all of these established, existing televisual forms. And the reason it's good isn't because it's like a book, right? But it's because it's a really good version and a thoughtful and innovative and sort of new vision of how to do those genres and how to make that sort of televisual part. And I think that people struggle, and understandably, I think people struggle with talking about why they like a show so much, or why somebody in the year 2000 was differently invested in The Sopranos than they were in like Friends or something, right? Or some more traditionally like genre-based television show. And I think one of the sort of easier ways to do that is to compare it to something high culture and obviously unquestionably worth your time, right? Which is a book or a poetry or something like that. So I think it's something I have thought about a lot. Also, as someone with one foot in literary studies and one foot in media studies, that is worth sort of keeping an eye on, I guess. And I think I was lucky enough to go to graduate school in a place where I had film professors who were really insistent on me learning about form and me learning about structure and the history of these media as themselves, right? Not as just visual versions of the literary media that I'm studying in another context. So thank you for the question. And NPR should have me on. I feel like I'm available.
Thank you. So I have a lot of thoughts, but of course, we can talk about it another time. My two questions are, I see that you're talking about screen time as you have this pivotal work that you found from the 90s where you talk about screen time. But if the book wasn't called Screen Time, what would it be called instead? And two, did it always start out as Screen Time because you're a television critic, and back when you started in 2012, we didn't have, or maybe we had apps then, I don't recall, but we didn't kind of have that. So something that I loved about the excerpt that you just read was you were talking about all the different ways that we engage with screens. I mean, even screens at the gas station, that sort of thing, right? Advertisements now, screens, that sort of thing. So, but I know there's a lot of wonderful television-specific stuff here. So did it start out as Screen Time, and also if it wasn't Screen Time, what would it be?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
I'll wait for it. Thank you, Martin. Thanks, Karen. So it's a great question. So Sarah Mesley, who I mentioned before, was my editor for this, and we worked really closely together on developing it and everything. And in the early days of our conversation, every time I would try to sort of frame the book in a way that was not sort of inclusive of all of the different devices, she would just like in this like shaming way just be like, well, if you want to do that, we can just call it Avidly Reads TV. Oh. And that's like a disincentive, I guess. So the screen time idea, I wanted to write a book about TV. I had written my scholarly monograph, and I was in a position to write a book, that was public facing, as Marty says, and that was for the audience of my TV criticism. And so I was thinking, I didn't really, I'm not a big enough deal at this point in time to be like, does anybody want a collection of essays that I've written right there? That was not really an available thing. And I didn't want to just write like a version of a scholarly book that didn't have footnotes in it, right? I wanted to have some other sort of grip on this. And I had written a piece for Slate. I had written two pieces for Slate. One was a piece about Frog and Toad, the book, the children's book.
That was a great one.
Thank you. The Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad book, and in which this was my like early pandemic project where I got in touch with a bunch of children's book authors, many of whom have books here, to ask them about the influence of Frog and Toad on their work, because I see it it's a wheel of those books, and maybe I love those books, and we saw it in Matt Barnett and in John Klassen and Keto McClear and all these great children's authors, and so I talked to them. And I think I started thinking a little bit more directly about like children's media as something that was interesting to me through those conversations. They were such smart people, and there were people who were like talking in the same way I was talking about TV about children's books, and it really sort of opened something up to me. And then I wrote another piece for them that was about the sort of little imaginative games that parents play watching TV that's made for very small children. So like trying to figure out like the genealogical charts of all the people on Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, or like
Elmo and the Rock.
and like how does the monarchy work there? Like how is Miss Elena the child of a puppet and a human man? Like, how does that stuff come together? And so I initially pitched this book to Sarah as Screen Time with the idea that it was going to be kind of about me writing these chapters that were paired texts of like where it would be like a chapter about The Sopranos and Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood that was about anti-heroes because Daniel Tiger is such a plan. And that was sort of the initial framing of it. And as we talked, I think the thing that we came to realize was that it wasn't just about that, right? And also that would limit the audience to some extent, right? That if you weren't someone who was well versed in both The Sopranos and Daniel Tiger, you'd miss a lot of the references that I was making and the fine intellectual arguments that I was making about that. And so it sort of developed just into the question of what the broader culture of those insights and those ideas was, right? Where does all this exist, and what's like the soup in which that occurs? And the Screen Time thing for me came into focus when I started to think about the idea that like I'm watching Daniel Tiger and then I'm watching these other shows and then I'm looking at my bank account and I'm ordering groceries and all these things on the same thing. This same like screen has all that stuff in it. And so there aren't like little compartments of my mind where those things exist. They're all in a soup too. And it's just sort of this fiction that we create to say that they're not connected and they're not sort of all bumping up against each other. And so the Screen Time concept became this like, not easy, but like neat narrative that I could draw, from a particular time to now, and also a sort of broader, brackets to put around a bunch of things that I could say about the idea. So thanks for the question.
Other folks? Coming back to you.
This is a much better job than I would. I really cherished reading your book, and so much cultural criticism that I value today addresses moral panic. And part of what foments and sustains moral panic is people not knowing what to do, particularly parents, particularly ourselves with our time, our doom scrolling, or et cetera. And when one doesn't know what to do, you seek guidance, you seek didactic literature. And so I'm wondering, what are you going to do when people expect a manual? When people come to book talks and like, how much screen time? What do you have, for this kind of strong misreading?
And also, can you tell us how much screen time is appropriate?
Thank you, Dave. Dave's here from Buffalo, New York. The first thing that I'm going to do is have a slightly lower Amazon score than I think I would otherwise have if there was a lot of good advice about screen time in this book. That's already beginning to happen. The book does not have advice in it, I'll say that. So one of the way I'll answer this, I guess, is to say that in order to write this book, I read a lot of those manuals and that advice. And there is, just to be clear, Tom Engelhardt, if you're here, his article, the original article where this idea comes from, or where this idea gets named, is pretty good. It's an article that's about the imbrication, the bad imbrication of advertising in children's television. He's writing in the 90s, and to him it's new. It wasn't new in the 1990s. It was very old in the 1990s. It's always been a part of TV. Especially children's TV, but the point, stands, which is that, your kids are watching what they think is, Howdy Doody, or what they think is Scooby-Doo, or what they think is, this or that show, but what they're actually watching is a long commercial for something, and that was a problem, right? Which it is, and so his critique is of that, right? But what it turns into over time is the sort of moral panic flavor that you're talking about, which is how many hours, what's happening, who's looking at my kids, what are they looking at, and sort of introducing this regulatory framing for it. And so a lot of the scholarly literature like goes in both of those directions. There are, and this is, I'm using the word scholarly loosely here, but there are books, you know, that are about screen time as, you know, digital heroin and you know, hyperbolic things like this. And then there are books that really sort of resonated with me as a parent that I read that are essentially about sort of how to come to terms with the not knowing, right? The effects of screen time are really hard to determine. They're hard to test, like in a clinical sense. They're very hard to know. It's hard to design an experiment that can tell you that, you know, this particular ill outcome, right? Poor physical fitness or you know, or poor mental health or you know, attention deficit disorder, all the things that people ascribe to screens specifically to determine whether they're screen-based, right? Whether those problems are screen-based. And so, you know, there are, I think, writers who just sort of say, oh, enough of this. Of course it's the screens, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily a wrong impulse, right? In part, and this is what the book is about, sort of, is that it feels that way, right? It feels like that's true. But when you read these other books, and there's a book called The Art of Screen Time by Anya Kamenetz, and there's a book called Screenwise by a writer named Deborah Heitner. They're really good at just sort of sorting through these studies and sorting throrough all of this stuff and saying, okay, well, what are the things that we can say are happening? And one of the things that comes up a lot is sleep. That a lot of the things that people attribute to the ill effects that people attribute to screen time overexposure are things that are traceable and have always been traceable to not getting very good sleep. And sometimes that can be screen-based, right? Where, you know, you look at the blue light too soon before you go to sleep and you have a hard time falling asleep and things like that. But there are a lot of other factors that impact, you know, adults and kids' sleep. So one thing I learned from reading here is that it's really important to sleep, no matter how much screen time you're getting. That might not be an encouraging thing to hear with a lot of people in this room, but it's true. And then the other thing I think that I've learned and that I see, you know, scholars and writers that I trust saying is that especially for kids, but also I think applies to yourself in a sort of self-reflective way, is that you need to talk to your kids and you need to talk to yourself, right, in terms of like self-reflection about not how much time you're spending, but what you're doing when you're doing it. You know, if you are having a bad experience on screens somehow, whether that's on social media or what you're watching, like what are you watching and who are you talking to and what are, you know, screens are media, right? They're media for social interaction and social interaction begins outside of them. And so, you know, I think that the first thing that I'll say is that I don't know, and I don't think anybody else knows either, for that matter. But also that there is a value in again seeing these things as social things, right? Not as unidirectional or not as parasitic, but as things you are interacting with and you are engaging with, and that paying attention to them, right? Not in terms of, you know, well, my limit's almost up for the day, but in terms of what am I interacting with? What am I engaging? What are the things that that make me feel good? What are the things that make me feel bad? And having a sense of that for yourself, but also for, you know, if you have kids, for your kids, or if you know kids, what they like and what makes them feel good about interacting in that way. I don't know. But I could have just said that, I guess, but like said more stuff instead.
Anybody else? Oh.
This is a totally self-indulgent question because I want to hear you talk about television and a show that I love, which is, why did you want to talk about Mad Men so much in the book? And why, like, what came out? Like, what are the pieces that you had to take away that you like hold on to?
I can attest that there is plenty of Mad Men.
Yeah. This was like a complex negotiation that I was really over leveraging my position in terms of this could have been the amount of Mad Men in this book is high. So don't worry if you came in wanting Mad Men. But also if you haven't seen Mad Men, it's not so high that it will be alienating. There are so Mad Men is a show that it's a show I love, but it's also a show that is emblematic to me of that sort of social foundation of my like media criticism life. It's the show that I recapped for the most time. It's the show that I most professionally recapped. I was very unprofessional as a recapper, but like that I was, that somewhere, it was the first time that somewhere that I considered to be like a big place wanted me to write like a weekly recap of it. And so it's a show that is sort of, that to me in my memory, that's the memory of that time of having this sort of social relationship to criticism, but also, and this is part of the role that it plays in the first chapter, is that it itself is a show about screen time. I think in a lot of ways, they make commercials for television, and they have this like very explicitly theorized relationship, the characters to screens. There are a lot of screenshotable moments of characters watching TV in Mad Men, or experiencing things through television collectively or alone. And so what stayed in the book was essentially that argument about Mad Men being a show that's about screen time from the earliest, not the earliest, but an early period in the history of television. The stuff that's not in the book, I think there was a lot more stuff about Betty in the book originally. There is a short Betty section. It was originally a very long Betty section, because the thing about Betty Draper is that her like catchphrase for the first season is "Go watch TV," and it's this. Everybody hates Betty, right? Betty's the villain of the first season, and her villainy is both like a problem of the show, and also one of the things that it sort of thinks about the most over the course of its 7 seasons. And the idea of her as like an icon of bad screen time, of like the 50s suburban mom who uses the television as a caretaker and outsources all of her parenting to some chintzy TV hour. I wanted to write a lot more about Betty, and I did. And so she stayed in here. I had this fantasy that I was going to send this book to January Jones and get her to like blurb it. But by the end, there was just so little of her left in there that I felt awkward just sending her this like para-academic book about the history of television. Be like, oh, Miss Jones, would you please say that this was a riveting exploration of something? So that's the main thing. There could have been a 7,000 or 8,000 more words about Betty Draper, but those words are available. I've written them; they're on the internet. So you've probably read most of them.
Well, one thing I can say is, trying to give a sense of what the book is, there really is so much incredible close reading, and in terms of Mad Men, there's a very memorable analysis of a scene where the characters are watching the moon landing, and the shot is from the perspective of the television. So basically, the characters are watching you, which is a kind of a figure in television that you return to quite a lot in the thing. But I'm not going to get on the road, so let's see if anybody else has any questions. No? All right, I'll ask my one more. And we started to talk about this when we were talking about the advice stuff, but something that's really important about this book is it's thinking about how sites of intimacy have changed in a media age. It's also taking the culture to task for its quickness to devalue the particular intimacies that media culture offers. I read this book less as a kind of just an analysis of television and the history of television or screens, more as an analysis of the received ideas that we have built up around televisions and screens, which is one of the reasons why I think that your personal material comes into the book so well, because it really is about how screens have become personal and trying to think about that. I wanted to ask, do you feel like this project is specific to this cultural moment? Is there a reason why a book that's doing that exists now?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Marty. I think it is very timely. If you want to tell anybody that it's timely, you can feel free to quote me or just pretend like you said that. I think something that has happened since the book came out is that there is this study, the CDC study about teens and mental health, and a lot of the sort of implications of that study and things that people sort of brought out of it is this sort of coincidence of the sort of rise of smartphones and the sort of dip in general mental health, especially teen girls in the US. And I think a lot of people have been very quick to say, okay, well, this is smartphones, right? Social media did this. And I think as the conversation about this has turned pretty quickly to, to the way the screen time discourse usually works, right? Which is about abstinence and regulation and policing. And I think that there are, I don't think that's a wrong implication to take from this, but I was listening to an interview with a psychologist the other day about this, and one of the things that she was saying is that, there are, social media and the screens that enable access to social media, do produce bad, bad things. You can be bullied online. You can have your sort of sense of yourself shaped in a deleterious way. You can be made to feel bad about yourself. You can be made to feel bad about the world you live in through those spaces. But there are also spaces where teenagers and everybody have good experiences, right? That there are communities you can find through social media that maybe a 15-year-old now wouldn't have been able to find in 1982. And that there are things about these experiences that render them not just complex, right, or not just ambivalent, but actively, good and bad, right? And the thing that the psychologist was saying was the idea that, school has a proportion that is similar to smartphones. That kids have experiences at school that are bad and make them feel bad about themselves, and that put them in these positions to see themselves in a different light. But there are also things at school that help them, right, and that educate them and allow them to find these communities. And that this is just something, the fact that these screens are these sort of external devices gives us this space to imagine them as foreign devices, right? But screens don't have anything in them that we didn't put in them, right? And they don't have anything in them that isn't part of the sort of broader social space. And we could talk about the way that screens accelerate social problems, but I think we can also talk about the way that screens ameliorate other social problems, right? And so coming to terms with this topic, I think, I was joking about the book being timely, I guess, but I think that one of the things that I think I try to do in the book, and that you brought up earlier, Marty, is the idea of just sort of accounting for screen time and paying attention to it. I think that it's easy to say smartphones are the problem, but what does that even mean, right? Smartphones are the problem. Is it the 5G? Is it social media, right? There are a lot of things that are implicit in smartphones when they are positioned as this sort of cultural nefarious presence, right? But they're complex things, and they contain a lot of different modes of engagement, a bunch of different sort of ways of seeing. And the first step to any of this, I think, is having an honest accounting of what you are doing when you're looking at screens. What is in that time, and what does that time mean to you as a person in the world? And I think that's what the book is trying to do. It doesn't come to any conclusions, but I think it offered to me a model for how I can think about what I'm doing when I'm looking at my phone or watching my TV or opening my computer.
I think we have time for one last question. Does anybody have one? I mean, I'm going to take it if you don't raise your hand. Okay, then I'll just take it. Just going off of what you were just saying, it basically spends the space of the book exploring the different ways that we live a life in screens. And basically, the one thing you can take from it is that we live a life of screens. So let's, instead of bemoaning it, let's think about what it means to live a life of screens. Given that, it's kind of interesting that you actually end, the last section of the book is on screenlessness.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the experience of being away from screens. And I was just curious if you could talk about that, talk about why you chose to end the book.
So the end of the book, there was a lot of stuff that cycled in and out of this book. It's a short book, so there were things that dropped out and things that popped in. About 4,000 or 5,000 words about house hunters hit the cutting room floor. Again, if you talk to me anywhere else at any time, I will give you those 5,000 words about house hunters or House Hunters International. But a thing I knew I wanted to write about the whole time was this app called SkyGuide, which Maeve, who's here, knows as Star App, which is a really great app that you can have on your phone. And it uses your location settings to orient the phone so that if you point it at the sky, it shows you what the constellations are. And you can identify stars, and you can see other junk that's up there, like rocket husks or International Space Station. And maybe when I started looking at this app, during the pandemic, I think mostly it was just the thing we did. And you can look at it outside, and you can look at it inside, and you can do a thing where, like, if you point it at the ground, it'll show you the stars that are on the other side of the world. And I just fell in love with this thing, and we had this experience. And a lot of this book, a lot of the memoir stuff in this book is about the summer of 2021, which is when we took a road trip to see some family and friends in Philadelphia and on the East Coast. And we spent some time in a sort of isolated cabin where there's no light pollution and there's no flight paths, and you can just see everything right when you look up. And that was a very special experience. And I think it was one that I talk in the book about how phones take really terrible pictures of the moon. Like that's a rule. But everybody keeps trying. You see a cool moon, and you're like, oh yeah, a picture of it. It just looks like garbage. And I thought about that a lot when we were just like out there. There was no connection. We didn't have Wi-Fi. There was no real access to the outside world through phones. And I kept thinking, like, even if I could, like if I took a picture of this, I wouldn't be able to capture it. But then there's this other thing that I get, and that Maeve gets, and Phoebe now is starting to get, from looking at the sky through that phone, right? When we get back at home, right? Where there is light pollution and where you can't see everything. But the app can see everything. It can tell you about it. It can tell you about what you can't see. And that, I don't know, I was thinking about that a lot, and it just struck me as something that, this is also the time that the James Webb Telescope brought out its sort of first images. And there was just a lot of space stuff happening. There's some UFO stuff in there too. But it just struck me that the sky is something, the night sky especially, is something that is like famously uncapturable by a phone, but also exists in this interesting relationship to it. And I wanted to end the book on a note of somewhat optimism about just everything that phones can do and everything that they can't do, and sort of living in the knowledge that they can do some things and they can't do other things, and remembering that that's true on either side of it.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up. I think we're out of time. But thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
So we do have, first off, thank you all. Beautiful crowd. We have books available for sale at the desk. We will be doing the signing out here in the desk area so that we can have another event this evening. You are more than welcome to join the second event if you would like. But yes, thank you all so much for being here. And go this way.
Yeah, we're gonna came back from my group and then for a few days. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did no work. So unfortunately,
Yes, and Heather's taking up getting from dance, and then the whole so we'll see how that goes.
I can call him on that. Yes. Can't do that with everybody.
He wasn't talking about.
No, not
Like 3 people had it.
I was. I wasn't just.
Oh, yeah.
Speak nicely.
You're on the air.
You're on the air.
I know. Yeah. No, I know. He couldn't. Just like, and he started quoting this essay
This one's
I know.
Yeah, it's like this is just she's like deep into like Mario 3.
Did you teach her how to blow up cartridges?
Yeah, but she can't do it right. It's so funny. No, she brings it to me and she's like, I can't get it. Because she like spits on it. Like,
He's around
it's a nice reminder when I'm getting vitriol spewed. Now Pasha in the car.
She really sold a lot of the.
She had no choice but to come and major. She wanted to, and I was like, she really thought she was going to help me. It actually works. You're a cheerleader for her.
She's so feisty.
Feisty. Yes. I know. She's like feisty friends. Now they're like, so they lounge there when they're 12. It's crazy. I wouldn't call us geniuses, but we pretend to have roommate trouble. No, oh my God, this weekend.
There's Matilda socks. Yeah. There what? There's Matilda socks.
Oh, those are they came out in the 70s. They were like, so they hit me. I think they were probably like newish when my mom did them. I loved them. We read them to Penny, and they're like, you can read a lot. Toad and Frog and Toad. Esme just was.
I think it was Frog
in a
the
musical.
school play.
I'm gonna look them up for my.
You need to come back because I'm offering everybody. But, and then, checking in with Allison and saying, oh my God, she's on vacation and I forgot that. She booked her own flight, but it's
She caught it.
yes. But it was interesting. She's someone that we've been having some difficulty with. Supposed to do a capstone project.
He's alright. He's like, you can
Now that you're like, we can do that, and she has been pushing back and having meetings with us. She's crying all the time, and I'm like, it's horrible. It's so horrible. I completely agree. I'm like, please go away. Yes, that's what I Good, and I'm thrilled, and I'm so glad I'm not there as well, because a intensive summer class, traveling with students, it's like having a flock of baby chicks or something, and I don't, I can't do it, but I don't know, we were talking a lot about after graduation, was, awesome, she is, and she's the best director, and I'm gonna audition, but I already have one. I know, no, we got him to sign it.
they're very.
Yeah, that's true. I have to get home for bedtime, so. Yeah, it's so nice to see you.
You doing the double header?
And she totally yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, Ramona was the.
Because you know I used to
But it's
Going just like me. It's like exactly. She's otherwise we
She ever like calm down?
Yeah.
No, we just started
Yeah.
I changed it.
No, her personality is it's like basically content.
There is, it says you need a key though, but maybe it's just unlock it. You do need a key, but do they have the key up there?
I'm on it. Okay.
Hello, Rachel.
I got, well, I'm gonna get this book and I'll